Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 60th episode of your favorite podcast, Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty. And the reason why I'm so excited for tonight is that I have not one, but two scholars joining me for the first time ever tonight. And I'm so pleased to welcome back Dr. David Graves and for the first time to welcome Dr. Matthew Glassman. For tonight, we'll be talking about this for me, very interesting and wonderful topic of the Ziggurats. So we want to talk about, what was the purpose of these buildings? How did they look like? How did they influence people and especially Gentiles in that time? And how can these buildings help us to understand certain portions of the Old Testament? And for that purpose, I just want to introduce, I would like Dr. Matthew Glassman as the new guest to introduce himself and say something when it comes to his spiritual and theological background, education, and some of the experience working on the field.
All right, thank you, Nicola, and great to be here with you as well, Dr. Graves. Good to see you again. So I am an instructor in the Religious Studies Department currently at Fairfield University in Fairfield, Connecticut. I received my PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, which is kind of a long-winded way of saying ancient history, from Yale in 2019. Before that, my background is in biblical studies and biblical languages. Did a degree at Boston College, Franciscan University of Steubenville before that, and was initially, my curiosity was sparked during my undergrad days when I took a class in Western civilizations at the University of Kansas way back in, I believe this was 2003. And I remember being very interested and fascinated by learning about the ancient city of Ur. Little did I know that a few years later, I would actually be able to visit the city of Ur myself, which I did in 2017, thanks to some much generosity financially from Yale, and actually saw one of the very first ziggurats, perhaps even the first ziggurat ever constructed in the ancient city of Ur.
That is so fascinating. When I was reading about you and your work, you mentioned that you visited 9 ziggurats. To me, that's such a privilege. I think that just seeing one in person would be amazing, but seeing 9 and writing a whole thesis on that, to me, that was amazing. So I can only imagine how it was to be in your shoes. And sure, it wasn't all maybe perfect, but just to be stand and witness these ancient monuments of history and being a witness and part of that. I mean, how did it feel like for you when you went first? And was it like a kid going to a candy store and being all this excited?
A little bit, as you might imagine, going to Southern Iraq in 2017 was I went kind of during the spring, but not exactly a spring break trip in the traditional sense. A lot of red tape and visas and things like that to get through. There were of course security concerns, more so for my poor wife at home worrying about me, but armed guards, stuff like that everywhere. But yeah, seeing the sites was absolutely fascinating. I think the first one we visited was a place called Akarkuf, which is sort of near Baghdad, the ancient city of Dur-Karagalzu, and as luck would have it, it's one of the best preserved ziggurats still today. So even just getting off the bus and being hundreds of yards away, you really get the sense of the immensity of these things and what just the majesty that they would have communicated to their viewer in ancient times. I tried to envision them, in their splendor and in their glory and in their heyday, rather than in their state of ruin. And they must have been very impressive. Almost like if you can think about driving down the highway and getting your very first glimpse of a modern city with its tall skyscrapers from miles and miles away, is sort of the image that I sort of conjured in my mind when I saw it.
That's amazing. It just reminds me something you wrote, that one of the purposes of the ziggurats was also to portray political power of the rulers of that day, so that people miles away walking in the city, they would see this and have this awe, like, wow, what an amazing structure. And now you're telling me that you felt the same thousands of years after the original people who saw this. That's just amazing. Dr. Graves, would you please reintroduce yourself for the audience again, please?
Well, I'm a doctor. I did my PhD on the New Testament area. So the Old Testament, while I've written some material on it, is not my specialty, although my PhD was on the Hittite suzerainty treaties. So I had my finger into the Hittite culture, as well as the book of Revelation in the Roman period. So when Nicola asked me to do a presentation on Ziggurats, I said, well, I know a guy, and Dr. Glassman and myself worked together in Shiloh in Israel the first season, and got to know him, and he helped me with some of the writings for my books because he's the expert on this. I'm not, and so I'm going to do some presentations with my PowerPoint and a few photographs, and we're just going to talk about some of the Ziggurats and just sort of had a casual discussion on things. But he's the expert. I'm sort of the tourist guide today.
That's a little bit gratuitous to call me an expert. I certainly looked into the question, but these things, as I mentioned before we went live, these things are ironically shrouded in mystery. They're the most obvious remnants of a very old and very ancient civilization, but we know sort of unfortunately little about them.
Well, I'm sure that we're going to be benefiting from your research, and academia will certainly benefit from it because, as you say, it's shrouded in mystery, and hopefully we'll unlock and inspire a few people perhaps to look into it, maybe even a little bit deeper.
That'd be great. I'll do my best.
So, Nicola, do you want me to start my presentation now? And
yes, please. Then, as you go, then, Dr. Glassman can comment. You can also throw in some stuff that you think that may be interesting when it comes to slides. I can ask some questions. If some live question also comes in, I'll also ask. But for the most part, I'll leave you gentlemen, just expressing yourself and commenting.
Yeah. Now, I must say that, I've traveled extensively and worked extensively for over 15 years in the ancient Near East, primarily in Jordan, some in Israel and Qumran. I've worked in Turkey, and then I've traveled in Egypt and the area, but I've never been to Iraq. So I've not seen the Ziggurats firsthand. So Dr. Glassman will have a firsthand account where I will necessarily be the tour guide as we travel through that. And I wish I had the opportunity to travel there. I've got some rare photographs that Dr. Bryant Wood had sent to me back in the early 80s, before it was even reconstructed at Ur. But anyway, I'll get things started here, and we can talk away here. If I just share my screen. Okay, so my first, this picture is actually an AI generated. There's a lot of that going around these days.
I'm sorry, but you didn't click on present, or at least we don't see it. It's not available down in the lower level.
It's still not okay. Present, share screen, share screen. Entire screen, allow. Are we good to go now?
Yes. Now everything is good. Yes, thank you.
All right. I don't see you, but I'll just go through my presentation and we can talk about it. Now the ziggurat here, like I said, is one that was AI generated. It's probably far larger and taller than it probably was originally, but it just gives everybody a sense of how large these things were. The material is based on my material in the archaeology of the Old Testament. The area we're talking about is down here in the Iraq, modern day Iraq. I'm going to talk about the Enuma Elish a little bit on the building of them. I want to talk about Saqqara, the Saqqara a little bit as well, how predominant these features were in the ancient Near East. Uruk and Nippur and Nimrod, so they're all over the place. I think at one point, Dr. Glassman, you mentioned to me that it were 32 to 35.
Yeah, 30 to 35 is the number. We have the ruins, and then we have textual references to other constructions that are called Zigguratu in places where they are either completely gone, or in, for instance, the city of Agade we are told that there is a ziggurat in an ancient text. We don't know where Agade is, so it's unverified. So between text and ruin, we have 30 to 35. This also kind of depends on your definition of ziggurat, which I imagine we'll get to as well.
Yeah. So basically, they're scattered all over the place, and every major city had one of these things popping up in the center of their city. Now, the one I want to talk about a little bit is probably one of the famous ones is the one at Tel Makayr. This would be modern, not modern, but what we would understand in the biblical text is Ur. It was discovered by this Italian back in 1625, Vele. And then we have Loftus, who excavated it for the first time in 1849. And then we have it being excavated and identified as the city of Ur from a inscribed brick by Henry Rawlinson. I've colorized these photographs from my book on the history of biblical archaeology that I just published, but normally you'll find these in black and white. And then, of course, Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s excavated it quite extensively, and we have a lot of the finds in the British Museum today. And so he discovered temples and the cemetery known as the royal graves and the residential houses. And the center of the settlement, of course, was the ziggurat, dedicated to Nana, the moon god, I believe. And you correct me, Matt, if I say something that's not correct.
Good so far, yes.
Yeah. The folks that worked at the site were Sir Leonard Woolley, and then his assistant was Max Malawan. And then Agatha Christie, the famous writer of English literature, ended up taking the Orient Express, traveling through the region, and stopped and fell in love with Max, and they got married. So husband and wife working there. And then, of course, another famous name is T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia. He worked Ur as well. So we have a lot of famous individuals working there. This is the lyre bullhead on the right from the tomb of Puabi. And a lot of the artifacts are in the British Museum today, and they've been restored, and very beautiful, gold and lapis lazuli and carnelian, and lots of stuff there that he discovered in the tomb of Puabi. And there's a photograph on the bottom left of one of the streets that was given to me by Dr. Bryant Wood back in the early 80s. So this would probably date in the 70s sometime. So a fairly rare photograph you don't find on the internet. And a lot of the artifacts are preserved in the British Museum, as well as the University of Pennsylvania Museum, which I visited, and photographs of that as well. And it describes the social and political conditions in Ur in the time of Abraham. So for those that are sort of chiming in from a biblical perspective, this sort of all relates to our understanding of the Bible, because Abraham possibly resided in that area. Now, there is debate. There's another Ur up here, and we know that Abraham went to Haran up here in the Hurrian area. And some have suggested that there's another Ur up here, but most scholars agree that he came from this region. So he would have been familiar with the culture and the artifacts and the ruins that we see today from this city. This is me in the British Museum looking at the Enuma Elish. According to the Bible, brick building technology began early in the history of civilizations at Shinar or Sumer, likely during the under the direction of Nimrod. Some suggest he was Gilgamesh. In Genesis 10, this technology was very different from the boulder and chink kind of method that was used in Palestine. But it was also used, of course, down in Egypt. The Babylonian epic of creation called the Enuma Elish, which I am holding a part of it in my hand, describes the use of brick technology in the construction of Babylon. Tablet 6 and line 1662. And here it is again. There's a number of pieces of it. And Walton describes the technology of baking bricks as an ancient trade developed toward the end of the 4th millennium. The resulting product used bitumen as a mastic, sort of like a waterproofing that would cause the mud brick to be very sturdy and strong, as well as putting papyrus and straw inside the mud. And since it was an expensive process, it would have only been used for important public buildings.
Just to chime in here, Dr. Graves, a little context.
Yeah.
Bitumen actually bubbles up in this area of Iraq to the surface where it was gathered, and often it was in the Bible. This is usually called pitch, and in fact, Tel El Makayr in Arabic means the hill of or the ruin of pitch. So it was natural there, and again, when we get to the ziggurat construction, typically what you would have is an inner core of simple sun-dried mud bricks, and then it would be encased in fired mud bricks, and then sealed with pitch or bitumen, which is a petroleum-based product, to make it waterproof. So you had a big kind of thick, solid core of sun-dried bricks, and then an outer shell or casing waterproof with bitumen and fired bricks.
Yeah. And this is like tar. We have it in the Dead Sea as well. It bubbles up from the bottom into these little clumps. So it was a product that traded and quite prevalent in the ancient Near East. Used a lot for that purpose of waterproofing. I think the Ark was even talked about being waterproof with bitumen. So that's some photographs of it there. So IA generated again. The Maiden Project has a good photo. This is probably a little more realistic than the one that was AI generated before. This one has it as 3 stories, and is there any indication as to how many stories they were? Was it a constant 3?
No. So the originals, there were 4 originals built during we call the Ur III period. Again, around chronological questions remain, but around the year 2000 or so. Rough estimate BC. Those originals were all 3 stories. Later on, we would increase those to 7 stories. Right? So the final form of the ziggurat in Babylon, be very careful not to call it the Tower of Babel, because we don't really know. And again, I'm a little dubious on that. The final form of the ziggurat at Babylon is purported to have been 7 stages. We have iconographies suggesting that. We, of course, unfortunately, we have nothing in actual existence that confirms that, but we're told it's 7 stages. There was also one that was 5 or 6 stages, depending on how do we count the temple at the top, or do we count the foundation as a stage in some of the northern types as well in Assyria. Good. So, but certainly the classical form would be 3 stages, as you see here.
Okay, great. That's what I was wondering on that. I wasn't sure. And as you had mentioned here, the core of the ziggurat was constructed using mud brick, which were covered with baked bricks on the outside. So the mud bricks were made of the mud and the reeds, as I mentioned, and their molds. I'll show you a mold here in a moment. The bricks were generally standard sizes, from what I could understand, 25 to 16 by 7 centimeters, weighing about 4.5 kilograms. Is that accurate?
We get a bunch of different types. So we have ziggurat construction for at least a millennium. So you'd imagine some variation
Sure.
based on regional differences as well, but generally in that neighborhood. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just as the cubit changed from different
Yes.
periods, they were different, slightly off measurements. There's one of the Egyptian mud brick molds to give people an idea. We actually made one of these and used it at Tel El Hammam. Made our own sun-dried mud brick to try and reinforce some of our archaeological areas. It worked out pretty well. We were pretty impressed with how well they dried in the sun, and pretty firm and a good structure. And so the Tower of Babel was such a building, I think, of some kind. The term Tower of Babel does not appear in the biblical text, and I think that's an important point. So we kind of impose stuff on the Bible when we talk about the Tower of Babel. But they built a city with a tower. It's mentioned in the Bible. And later the text explains that therefore its city name was called Babel, that is Babylon, with a play on the Hebrew verb babel, meaning to mix or confuse, because there the Lord confused the languages of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. Did you want to comment on that, Matt?
Yeah, so often you read this in commentaries that Babel is a play on the word Balal in Hebrew. I personally am not so sure about this.
Okay.
And I think a better explanation would be to kind of cast this in Akkadian terms. So Bab-El, such as from the words Babum or gate, and Elim for gods or God, gate of the gods. So,
yeah,
which one of the arguments I'm going to make or I did make in my dissertation, was that one of the functions of the ziggurat, at least as far as we can tell, is to facilitate communication between the realms of human beings and the realm of the gods, of the divine. So, in some ways, this is the gate of the gods, breaking into humanity and human history. So, Balal, perhaps, I don't know if that's a happy coincidence in the Hebrew or not, but my own sort of suspicion is that it has more to do with the Akkadian here. Bab-El meaning, in particular this city being the Babum Elim, that in construct, of course, Bab-El, the gate of the gods, a place where the gods could break into the human realm and interact with humans in history.
Yeah, or a gate to the gods.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And it could very well have been a subtle, coincidental play on words, as you say.
Yeah, it could be.
This idea of confusion in the text there in Genesis 11. There's a lot of that kind of stuff that we find in the text, I think, in Hebrew. We don't pick it up so much in the English. Good point. I like that. I can buy that, no problem. One of the medieval depictions, I always get a chuckle out of this because they made it like a fruit cake, all round, going up. This is probably a little better depiction of what the cities would have looked like. It's interesting that the ziggurats were always in the center of the city. I think that is correct, is it not?
Well, certainly in the public areas, right? So you would have a sacred complex, and this would be an area that was separate and distinct. If we cast this in modern terms, it would not be zoned for residential, is the way I would put it. Sometimes the topography of the city dictated where that it wasn't particularly in the middle of the city, but certainly this was in the public area near the main temple. There would have been other temples as well, and then the area where the elites and the king would have lived would be nearby.
Yeah, I remember when I was down in Mexico and looking at their temple down there as well. It seemed to be right in the middle of the city. So it seemed to be
often in the middle of the action. There are a couple places I'm thinking of the city of Ashur in Assyria. Its ziggurat, I believe, is in the northern part of the city, but that has more to do with the topography of where the city sits on this kind of escarpment or hill crest, more so than
okay. All right. Well, the same kind of thing I argued with the identification of Livius at Tel el Hammam in the Roman period. We have the bath complex, and everybody is saying that the city was, about 2 kilometers away or a kilometer and a half away. But I argued that this was more the administrative part of the city. And so you have that same kind of thing. Also, in a lot of the tells, you have a necropolis, and you'd have the temple, or you'd have the administrative center of the palaces up on the Acropolis overlooking the rest. So very common practice in the ancient Near East to have these as a prominent feature, not so much in a residential area, but set apart. And this image sort of depicts that with a little gate around in blue, and
yes,
you have the residents all around
and probably restricted as well. So I wouldn't imagine that anyone could just kind of stroll in here on a whim either.
Right. So most scholars suggest that the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat of some kind, or had reference to that. That's what they had in their minds when they wrote the text. And there are about 32 to 34, as you'd mentioned earlier. The earliest example dates to the reign of Namu, 2047 to 2030, in lots of these cities of we mentioned that already, I think. So I think that's one of the earliest. You might find them earlier, would you say, Matt? Or
well, here again, I have to be I kind of have to be a little bit of a nitpicky academic here. This depends on your definition of a ziggurat. Now, in my definition, I argue that, in fact, it was Ur-Nammu that intentionally created this architectural form, and that these are, in fact, the first ones at Ur, Nippur, Eridu, and at Uruk. We don't quite know which one was the first, perhaps Ur, but maybe Eridu as well. Eridu was one of the perhaps the earliest shrine city that humankind ever knew. Nippur also was never a political, both of these cities, never political centers, never exerted dominance over other cities or over the region, but always important religious centers.
Okay. So being a religious center, certainly these would have predominance then in those places for sure.
Yeah.
Here's one of the early photographs I have from Dr. Bryant Wood from the early 70s. And as I said, I was grateful when he sent these to me. I met Dr. Bryant in Toronto when he was doing his PhD in Palestinian pottery, and kept in touch with him all those years. And he sent me these for a project I was working on. So I came up, and back in those days, he had to send me the photograph in an envelope. So it wasn't digital back then. So I scanned these and put them in. So that's what it looks like, or looked like. You can just sort of see the very bottom of it. Still the mud brick intact. And the top, of course, has deteriorated over the years. You see a few bricks down here. But this is an early photograph of it, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, if I could point out just one thing here, Dr. Graves, sorry to interrupt you again, but if we look on as we see the ziggurat here, there's one kind of important feature on the left side as we look at it. Right there. So that facade is characteristic of temples and sacred edifices, especially in the south of Mesopotamia, which we call a niched facade. So it's one of the ways that we can look at a building and say, hey, that's very likely an important building, probably a sacred building. So a modern analogy might be, go to any major city in the United States, and when you see a big stone building with pillars and Corinthian capitals on the front, what is that? It's the courthouse, right? So same sort of idea here. And this is, of course, not what it looks like today. In the 80s, I believe, the mid-80s, earlier mid-80s, Saddam came, and as a kind of reconstruction project, he put a modern brick.
I'll have a photo for you.
Yeah, a facade around that. So this is not what you would see if you went there today.
Right. Exactly. And this is why I like this photograph, because it sort of untampered with, as it would.
Yes. This
would
is what
be-
Woolley would have encountered when he showed up at Ur.
Exactly. They've translated the Sumerian, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, for Itamaki. Is that a correct or an accurate?
So Atem and Anki was the ziggurat in the city of Babylon.
Right.
And it would be, so very literally, the Sumerian, it would be the sign is actually E number 2, which means house, which can mean anything, can mean palace, can mean temple. And then Temen is like a foundation, peg. So in ancient Mesopotamian construction, you would often you would dedicate your important buildings, and the Temen was specifically it's literally looks like a giant clay nail, I suppose, and you would put it in the foundation amidst the bricks. But it was like it was symbolically like the foundation. It linked it to the ground, the foundation to the ground. Of
Okay.
On. So the on sign is a star. It can mean deity, or it can just mean star or sky. And then Ki is earth. So the foundation of heaven and earth. So
Right.
literally the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. That's actually not a bad translation at all.
Good. Okay. And dedicated to Marduk in this particular.
In Babylon, yes, Marduk
Babylon
would have been the god of the city of Babylon, certainly.
Yes. Okay. And there were a lot of them. We point out there's Enlil, Enki, or a whole lot of different ones.
Yes, Enlil was the god of Nippur. That's where he principally lived. He would have had temples, of course, everywhere. And then in Ur, that was one of the cities of the moon god. So one of the interesting questions about Abraham is, I believe his father is linked to the worship of the moon god, and the moon god is the principal god of the city of Ur, sort of akin to like the Greek city-states had their own deities the same way in the Mesopotamian, which were also city-states in the early days.
Yeah. And this one was 3 stories and accessible by a prominent staircase. We haven't talked about the staircase yet, but that was a prominent feature. And there's a staircase going up to this one that's AI generated. And it contained a temple at the top, built to house and worship the gods of heaven. But no priest resided in the structure, as its only purpose was for the gods. Did you find that in the research? Is that correct?
Yes. Now, I'm going to get into some hot water if there are any Assyriologists watching, but so yes, there's a temple at the top, which we're a little bit fuzzy on the precise terminology in Akkadian, but it seems to be this word gugunu, that is the small temple atop these, whether it's 3 or 5 or 7 stages. And what happened in there? Well, it's hard to say because there are none of them left. We haven't been able to excavate any of them because they've all been eaten up by history.
Right.
So we don't precisely know, but there are a few obscure literary texts that refer to gods going to the top of them. There is also and this is where I'm going to get into trouble, is this issue of something called the sacred marriage, this marriage between simply cult prostitution between a human female and a deity, which would possibly have been represented by one of the city's priests, especially in Babylon. Okay. Now, there is debate as to what precisely the sacred marriage was, what exactly happened in the temple at the top. There are references to sort of bedroom furniture in there. I'll kind of leave it at that. But there are people who believe that this was kind of all just mythical and made up and not necessarily something that actually took place. So opinions vary. I do not have a strong one on that.
And we have some scholars that sort of argue on the Nephilim with this marriage between the gods and the humans as well, that kind of carries over possibly to the Old Testament.
Yes.
So
yeah. What does all this mean? Well, we
yes,
have scant evidence in both the Bible and in Mesopotamia that
exactly.
is there something there? Well, perhaps something, but precisely what that is, we don't really know. Suffice it to say that yeah, people did not live there. It does not
Right,
seem that people lived. It was not. It was this was not the parsonage, for instance, right? So
right.
this is not where anyone lived. This was a sacred area, and probably was again very restrictive. You couldn't just stroll up to this thing and look
Ceremonial
around.
practices and um, I mean, very much like I guess what you'd have with the temple in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies.
Correct.
So it's a place where business was done, the meeting of God with his people, but not a place of residence. It was
So
rebuilt
I'm
by,
sorry, Doctor. I just have a quick question for Dr. Glassman. This reminds me when I was talking with I forgot whom, and even maybe reading by Dr. Heiser, how this resembles what was mentioned with King Og. So how his ceremonial, bed resembles one of these, Gentile ancient Near East portrayals of the ziggurat and bed with similar dimensions and maybe potentially similar purpose. I know this is not verified, but there are some Bible commentators, especially those who invested a lot of time, like yourself, in ancient Near East studies, and who see some parallels, in some parts of the Old Testament, like with the King Og, and these examples elsewhere found outside the Bible, but still within the ancient Near East context. So I just want to ask you if you have maybe studied something when it comes to this area.
I have not particularly looked too far into it. The scholar who really kind of came up with the theory of the sacred marriage, I believe this is back in the 50s or the 60s, is a guy named Kramer with a K, Kramer. He would be the place to look. I kind of found this a little bit too ancillary to my own topic and my own research. So I must confess that I haven't looked too terribly much into it, even though it's controversial and of course a sort of it's an interesting topic, but not necessarily of too much interest to me. I have to
a
confess.
rabbit trail.
Yeah.
Well, it was rebuilt, the one that we have here in Ur, by Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC, which is kind of interesting as well, according to Herodotus and other scholars that are listed there. So it had been fixed up quite a bit during those time periods. This is what it looks like before. I guess it's what it looks like today. This is kind of a ground level view of it, showing the palace foundation in the foreground with the ziggurat in the distance. And I just wanted to give everybody sort of an idea of the complex that was around it, which is not a recreation. This is the actual remains. I've put a few of the recreations up to help with the imaginations. There's another photo of it. You can see the ziggurat there in the distance. But you have some archaeological remains. You can still see the bricks, the arches. I'm not positive whether those are sort of from a later period or not.
Yeah, these may be later, Dr. Graves, and this to me looks like. So if you go to the city of Ur today, it's in I suppose in some ways a sad place because the area has been ravaged by war. The U.S. service members. I have friends actually with in uniform with taking their picture on the steps of the ziggurat there. So at one point, and this must have coincided with the reconstruction of the facade, they tried to turn it into something of a tourist park or
Right.
like an outdoor museum, right?
Yeah.
And this to me looks like, and again, this is a scholarly debate. Outside of this area here, you would see a sign that says essentially in Arabic, the house of Abraham. And so you can go
Right.
and you can look in Abraham's kitchen and his bedroom and everything. Now, Is that really
Torso.
the case? Well, it's a big house in Ur, and who knows, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So that might be what that is, and I suspect we may have some modern work there taking place with the arches.
yeah, yeah. Good. Um, Here is the Alexander the Great attempted to rebuild and the decaying ruins by moving the structure brick by brick as well. So it's kind of interesting that he had a hand in it. So they've all kind of wanted to rebuild this. Unfortunately, he died before completing the project, and all that remains today is the base, as we see there in the photograph. We've talked about that. Now, Andre Perot was excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley, but Perot believes that this ziggurat was the Tower of Babel. Now, he's quite an influential French scholar from the 1950s. So that was his theory. There's the photo you were talking about earlier. This is what it looks like today with the remains. Saddam Hussein tried to rebuild it. He wanted to turn it into, he wanted to be the next Nebuchadnezzar. And 1993 to 2003, he started to rebuild it. There's the steps, of course, going up and the very distinctive sides to it that have been, and then he's got one story, and then he's got a second story started, and but that's where it stopped. Is that what you saw when you were there?
That's essentially what I saw when I was there. I would call attention to so one of the defining features for me is what we call a ziggurat is in fact those staircases. You can see the main staircase leading up to that one right there, and then there are two lateral staircases, and they all meet right at the top of the first stage. So
Right.
that seems to me, when ancient texts say this word in Akkadian, Zigguratu, that's what they mean.
Okay.
Most generally, now at least originally. Now there are other forms that are derivative of this that don't necessarily correspond to this, especially in the Assyrian north. But at least at first, this is what is meant by Zigguratu, which would distinguish it from other scholars, including Perot, I believe, would maybe call proto ziggurats or
Right.
other ziggurats, which I doubted in my dissertation, and basically said no, those are temples on top of mounds or on top of platforms, not quite the same thing.
Okay. Good. And there's a ground level view of it. There's the staircases you were talking about.
Yeah.
One here on the left, and then there's another on the right, and going up. What I find it kind of interesting, it reminds me of the passage in Genesis 28 that he dreamed. Behold, there was a ladder set up on the top, or on the earth, and the top of it reached the heavens, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And this kind of brings to mind that that image of Jacob's ladder. Now, I didn't look up the Hebrew term there for ladder. I should have, but that's what it reminds me of. That they may have been referring to something like that. The gods being on the top of the temple, and then walking up and down that. Did you come across anything in your research on that?
So the interesting linkage between Genesis and things happening in the Semitic West versus the Semitic / Sumerian East is actually a phrase, and the term for ladder. I knew this intimately 7 years ago when I was writing this, and now it's of course not coming to me. And now that I'm live on YouTube, but the phrase that you get in Hebrew is something like a migdal, right? A tower with its top in the heavens, right? That's what we read in Genesis 11. And in inscriptions, there's an early inscription from the reign of Samsu Luna, which is, we all remember King Hammurabi from the Hammurabi Codex. His son is a man named Samsu Luna. He's ruling in Babylon in about probably the 1700s or so BC. And he reconstructs a tower at a place called Larsa, and he says that he made its top like the heavens, right? In Akkadian, Reshisha Kimashame, right? Its top like the heavens. and it's basically the exact same phrase, right? In Hebrew we have rosh for top, and so it's essentially the same language. Now, how did it get that way? I would argue that there has to be some sort of transference between East and West here, that we have the exact same phrase for the Migdol and for the it's called the Samsui Luna bilingual inscription. It's in both Sumerian and Akkadian.
Right.
Now, as far as Jacob's ladder, I of course, in all my courses, that's what you would learn is, yes, this is the image of the staircases of the ziggurat that is depicted in Jacob's ladder, where the figures, angels or divine figure, whoever we're talking about, in Jacob's dream, they're descending and ascending down this thing. And of course, there's a tantalizing parallel to what some of the gods in Mesopotamia do as well. But what we really like to see is either they use a term like Migdol in the East, or they use a term like Zigguratu in the West, and they just don't. They just do not say, they don't call it the same thing. That doesn't mean that it's not possible, but it would sure be nicer for us modern scholars if they would have done that.
Right. Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of borrowing from the Akkadian words and the Hebrew words as well, for a lot of different places in the Old Testament. So there's a lot of commonality, a lot of borrowing and similarities between the languages. I should have looked up that word. I meant to do that actually for ladder, because we have this idea of a ladder sort of being like a step ladder that you'd use to change a light bulb, but this is not, I don't think.
Yeah, not the same thing.
No. So could have been translated. There's an A there from the ESV, and I didn't even look that up. It may have said stairway or something up on the earth. Anyway, just a bit of a side note there, but there's the photo I think you were referring to.
Yes.
So we have the U.S. military climbing the stairs, going up to heaven.
Right.
Hopefully not literally in 2010.
Yeah.
Dr. Graves, I just checked the ESV. It says a flight of steps. That will be the secondary translation for the ladder.
Okay.
Yeah, so flight of steps.
Yeah, I'd like to. Does it say what the Hebrew word is?
No, it does not.
Just as the translation of it, because that's the important part, is what the actual word is, because they sometimes translate things, based on interpretation, not based on etymology. So anyway, just curious. A little project for your viewers. What's the Hebrew word there?
Sulam. Sulam, that's the word. Sulam. That's the letter. Yeah, and I don't know this word in Akkadian. I nothing is coming to mind as a cognate, so I'm not sure. But yeah, it's Sulam Hebrew.
Sulam. Interesting. Well, a little bit of that always kind of fascinated me with the similarities there. And when I saw the ziggurat and the stairs, and then I read the passage, it always sort of, okay, that's probably more what we're talking about. I'm a visual person, so that's what I always go back to as my memory of the photographs. And Harris, of course, and other Old Testament scholars argue that Etemani influenced the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. This is the particular remains at Borsapa. So this is the remains that are there today.
So this looks like this actually looks like Babylon. So yes. Borsippa actually is maybe the most well preserved. It's still huge. It's enormous, and this must be Babylon, because what happened is Alexander, during the Hellenistic period, decided that he was going to rebuild the Atemenanki in Babylon, and he leveled whatever structure was there, most likely a ruin. And then sadly for the city of Babylon, he died, and none of his successors seemed to care too terribly much about restoring the original ziggurat. So that is what it looks like essentially today. It's basically a pit, kind of almost looks like a moat around it, and then there's a square in the middle of it, and that's all there's left, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. This is the one
There's
at,
yeah.
oh, it's left. This is the one at
Yes,
Recipa.
that is Borsippa, sometimes called Beers Nimrud.
Yeah, I think I have the names mixed with my photos. The Sumerian tablet entitled the Inmarkar and the Lord of Arata provides a compelling parallel, I think, of the Tower of Babel account in Genesis with the Ziggurats. Now, you probably looked into this when you were doing your research. It says, in those days of yore, when the destinies were determined and the great prince allowed Eanna, that's the temple or ziggurat of Anna, to lift its head high. And then we also have a reference here to the golden age when it says there was no fear, no terror. In those days, the land resting in security, the whole universe, the people in unison, to Enlil in one tongue, Enki, the Lord of wisdom, changed the speech in their mouth, contention into the speech of man that until then had been one. And so we have this notion of the babel of tongues in Sumerian, where you have this dispersion of people speaking one language, and then they are dispersed throughout the land. Now, so this is where I get with the Tower of Babel and the dispersion of people with the languages. We have an ancient or Babylonian account of it that may have been picked up in oral tradition from the original events, and then of course written down in the Babylonian account, and then written down in the biblical account according to their own understanding from the ancient Near East of their gods. What do you think about that, Matt? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, this is kind of the in Merikar and Lord of Arata is kind of a fascinating text that is written in Sumerian. So again,
Yep.
we're dealing with another language here. So
Yep.
what translates to what? A little bit of context here. Again, Enlil was originally, at least prior to Marduk's ascension after the Babylonian period, he was the king of the gods, the head of the pantheon. And Enki is the god of the very important city, Eridu. Eridu.
Mhm.
So perhaps the earliest temple that we know of is at the city of Eridu, certainly in Mesopotamia. And
Right.
Eridu is identified, at least in Sumerian texts, as the first city, the first city ever. Enki is its god, and Enki is an interesting character in Sumerian literature. He is kind of he's sort of like a trickster, and he plays tricks on mankind. He also plays tricks on his fellow deities. And so, yeah, this is again kind of an interesting parallel that it's very interesting when we look back at the ancient world that and the Bible being one of the ancient texts that is certainly parallel to others, and we get echoes, right? So
Right.
in Genesis 11, we have a very specific account of God coming down and confusing the language of human beings in order for them to disperse, to scatter, right?
Right.
And we hear what might be a convoluted echo of that in
Mhm.
this other texts from very far away, and without getting into the thorny problem of when we date Genesis and all that.
Sure.
We certainly have a parallel. Now,
Right.
what does this do with the ziggurat? Hard to say. It seems as though the place where much of the narrative for In Merocar and the Lord of Arata takes place is actually in the north, outside of Mesopotamia. Arata almost certainly being the area of Ararat, which is in and around Armenia today. So one of the interesting contentions that scholars have made, most famously by Sir Leonard Woolley, by the way, after his work at Ur,
Right.
is that the ziggurat is an artificial mountain.
Right.
Now, I have to confess, I have some sympathy for this point of view. When I remember being a young doctoral student, and one of my first classes, kind of sitting in class thinking about the ziggurat and its purpose when one was mentioned. I thought, oh, well, they're in Mesopotamia. They have no stone. They have no high places. They're in the alluvial floodplain. What do they do to reach the gods? Well, they have to build this big platform like a mountain. And I thought, hey, you know what? What if the Sumerians, their language, there's no known antecedent. We don't know where they come from, but it seems as though the archaeological record observes people moving in to Mesopotamia from the north and from the east, and therefore they must have come down from those mountainous regions. They had no high places, so they built one. I thought that this was an original idea, and I discovered that Leonard Woolley had actually he had come up with this concept about 70 years before it occurred to me. He would go on to posit some other things that have quite honestly been laughed out of court a little bit in academia, such as planting trees on the ziggurat, which involves sort of impossible hydrological and would have caused construction problems for the ziggurats.
Yeah.
But
water.
This idea of the ziggurat as mountain, insofar as ziggurat as high place, right? Mm-hmm. I think is actually a very meritorious idea, and one that I agree with myself.
Yep.
Because what is a ziggurat other than an artificially created high place, right? Yep. That is, I believe, what it is. And it is also interesting that most of the ziggurats, probably all of them, but we don't have all of the names. Most of them had ceremonial names which invoke mountains or high places.
Yeah. And of course, I've been to Mount Ararat and climbed in the Ahura Gorge on the Armenian side. And so with the descendants coming down from, Noah's descendants moving down from the mountainous regions of the Urartu, and then coming down into the Mesopotamian region, as you say, they wouldn't have had any mountains down there to correlate. So, yeah, build one.
Right. Yeah, the early archaeological record seems to suggest that people moved down from Armenia at some point.
Yep.
And across, through those kind of in between regions of the plain and the steppe, through the Iranian plateau and along the mountains there, and then at some point, for whatever reason, entered Mesopotamia. So. Yep. They had no high places. They would have been used to having them in the foothills and in the mountains. And so, yep. What do you do if you don't have a high place? Well, you build one.
Right. Yeah, makes perfect sense.
I'm sorry, Dr. Glassman. I just have one question for you because I'm very curious.
Sure.
When it comes to that previous, slide we saw, when it comes to that poem, explaining Mesopotamian and Babylonian deities and how they explain how the confusion of tongues and all that story. And as you said, it reminds us of Genesis 11. Could it be that unlike the skeptics who likes to point out all the time how Bible authors borrow heavily from from the Gentile authors, could it be first thing that the oral tradition of Genesis from 1 to 11 was very old, but just passed, like I said, orally from from generation to generation until it was written down? And B, because we know in apologetics they use this tool called polemics. So in the same fashion, we see that Baal was, for example, a Lord who's flying on the clouds, and then we see Yahweh doing the same. So we see, like Dr. Heiser and maybe Walton and some other scholars that will point out, well, this is not stealing. This is because the authors of the Bible knew the Gentile accounts. They were correcting, using these polemics and saying, no, it's not Baal. We'll correct that and point out that God, Yahweh, is the rider of the clouds. Many other things, like, for example, in Gentile accounts, we see this chaos camp, like how these deities were fighting with the chaos dragon, like Leviathan or something else. And then we see accounts in with Leviathan, but also they say that could be in Genesis 1-2, which is very debatable. But my point is that if we see these portions of the Old Testament scriptures used as polemics, even though they could be coming later after Babylonian, Mesopotamian accounts, could it be that in this same sense, Genesis 11 either came earlier but orally, or B, second thing, came later but intentionally correcting this Babylonian account, but just explaining in Genesis 11 as Yahweh doing this with people and not Marduk or some other gods?
Yeah, both are, of course, possible. I may offer a third possibility, my own, and I will just give you a brief kind of synopsis of my own view of Genesis. So, starting from the traditional assumption that Moses is the author of Genesis, as well as the rest of the Pentateuch, what does that precisely mean for Genesis, right? And we have a problem there, because anyone has to admit, right, whether you're a skeptic and a revisionist, or whether you are the most conservative fundamentalist reader of the text and a strict literalist, we have to admit that the first question we have to ask when we talk about, especially Genesis 1-11, is how did Moses know all that stuff? And that is presumably thousands of years before he lived. So how does he know that? And I've seen people posit interesting theories about prophetic visions on Mount Sinai and oral traditions lasting thousands of years. I'm not so sure about any of those. And I think one sort of practical suggestion I would make is that if we want to call Moses the author of Genesis, right? Fair enough, fine and good. But author in the sense of, I would consider him something of an editor or a compiler, right? So if you buy an anthology, the guy's name on the front is actually the editor, right? He's gathered everything. And I think that there's enough evidence, which would be another longer conversation, that Genesis is in fact, what we know of Genesis today, there are actually different underlying documents that constitute Genesis. And at least 10 or 11 documents that have been woven together or sewn together, perhaps by Moses, but as an editor. So do I think that oral tradition lasted that long? Well, I don't really know enough about oral tradition and memory in the ancient world. I'm sure it was better than ours, right? They weren't on screens all day, every day like we are. But do I trust oral tradition to last 1,000 or more years? I'm not so sure. I think that the sort of final version of Genesis is a compilation of underlying documents, and I think that, I think that is what happened. We have reference to works. I think at least 3 or 4 works in Genesis that are separate books that seem to record material that ends up in Genesis, right? So the books of the Wars of the Lord is the one that comes to mind off the top of my head. So I think we have written documents before Moses, and I think that if he is the author of Genesis, which I take him to be, it is something of an editor, right? I think that is what happened. So I don't know if that splits the difference or what, but that's kind of my assumption about Genesis, and we could have a longer conversation about why I think that is. I did a little work on this issue way back in one of my master's degrees. But that is what I think is going on in Genesis. So I would not assume this long oral tradition. And the idea of polemic is interesting, though. I hadn't really considered that myself. But my assumption is that the material that we find in Genesis predates what we find in, for instance, the ancient Near East. Again, this is a longer conversation as to why I think that. I've sort of been working on and off on an academic project over the last 10 plus years to demonstrate this, and haven't really got around to finishing it yet. But yeah, that would be, I think, an interesting conversation for perhaps another day. But yeah, I would not. I shy away from these long oral tradition arguments. I just don't. Perhaps this is just a bias. I just don't think that's possible. I don't know that ancient memory is that good.
Yeah, well, I would argue that it's a combination of both the oral tradition, which was very well ingrained in the ancient Near Eastern mindset. I mean, even to the point of we have the acrostics in the Psalms and things that were designed for memory. That was the way they would pass these stories down from generation to generation. And the fact that we find the similarities between the creation epics, the flood epics, and now we have this idea of the confusion of tongues as well, and other stories in the text. I think that there is Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. That's my stance, as is yours,
Mm-hmm.
and that I have no issue with Moses using other written documents, but then under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and of God, he was able to depict the oral tradition in its proper context from an understanding of Yahweh as God, as compared to the ancient Near Eastern oral tradition that portrayed it in terms of their gods and their language. So that would be my take on it.
Yeah, no problem with anything you said there, Dr. Graves. My sort of thought on this is that Moses was working with pre-existing material, and they would be something like annals or even like family histories.
Yeah. And there's no doubt that that's the only way that people would transfer information from family to family. A lot of it was through oral tradition. Some annals, some writing. I'm not one to say that they didn't have writing that early. We find more of that in the archaeological record now than when they didn't know the Hittites existed, and then we find a whole great big archive of thousands of tablets. And now we know their, because I did my PhD work on the Hittite documents and suzerainty treaties. So we know that there was writing that early. How much of it there was, I don't know, but I think there's a combination of oral tradition as well as the written record for those that couldn't read and for those that could read those ancient texts. I think there was more that could read than we think. Alan Millard has done a lot of work. He was my reader for my PhD. He's done a lot of writing on that. So I think there's a combination of that. And Moses used it all, but then under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, he was able to put the Yahweh's version, which I think is the correct one, into the biblical record in the writing of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, I would add just one more note. We don't necessarily have to limit ourselves to Hebrew in this regard.
Right.
So does Moses compose the final form in Hebrew? Well, probably. And I think that there's enough evidence to suggest that there was Hebrew or something like it, whether we call it West Semitic or whatever. This is another rabbit hole, of course, we could go down.
Well, the other thing we need to remember is that
Moses, certainly, but is he working with source documents that are perhaps in another language? I would just raise that possibility.
Well, and Matt, we need to remember that Moses is raised in Egypt and had access to all of the the libraries and documents of the Egyptians, which was quite extensive. So you're correct, I think, in your assumption that we're not just dealing with Aramaic or Hebrew here. We're dealing with a lot of ancient texts and languages, and Moses was well educated in those.
Yes, he would have known. He would probably have been multilingual.
Yes.
And we know that, yeah, not to get into the question of how old is Hebrew, because I know that there are other people who know way more about that, mostly Doug Petrovich, than I do.
Doug, yeah.
And I am not a scholar of Egyptian, so I don't know that. But we have writing way before. We have writing. I mean, we have writing as early as perhaps 3300 BC, and it seems to forms of writing seem to originate in both Egypt and Mesopotamia around the same time. Sort of interesting how that happens. And I mean, by the mid third millennium, we have poetry, we have literature. So the possibility of writing is very early and can absolutely accommodate that. Just because just because the form that has come down to us is in Hebrew doesn't mean that there's something else lurking underneath.
Yeah. Right. Good. Well, I'll just move on here in my presentation with I just deal here with the language again. We already discussed that. And again, we go to Egypt and I think Saqqara here with the pyramids. So we have a lot of these structures that are built up into the sky with this idea of a building built up into the sky that and again, Moses would have been familiar with this kind of an idea from where he came from when he wrote the Pentateuch. So I don't take this off the table in the background of his thinking when he writes the text, that this could have been a bit of his in the background of his mind. And they use bricks as early as 10,000 BC as well, the mastaba. And I just wanted to throw that in because I sometimes think we forget. Abraham comes from the Babylonian region up into Haran and then down into the Promised Land, and then we have Moses who writes the Pentateuch coming out of Egypt, who is prolific in the history and the language of Egypt, and this as well. And so I think this all has influence on how they would have seen and understood when they read the text in those particular from those particular backgrounds. I guess there's my map again. So this whole area is filled with the these kinds of structures. So I'm not surprised to find them in some way showing up in the biblical text. The brick structure on the top was constructed by the Americans, archaeologists in the 1900s. This is the one in Nippur. You probably have seen this one. You probably have better photographs.
Yes, I've been there. And I know this is just a type on the slide, but this is in Iraq today.
Yeah.
This is not far from Ur, actually. And yes, this would have been really the spiritual center of Mesopotamia for most of what we think of as Mesopotamian history. Eridu seems to, for whatever reason, fallen out of fashion in the third millennium, and this became essentially, Assyriologists, you'll see them calling it something like the Vatican of Mesopotamia for most of the history and up through really even into the Hellenistic and to the Roman period, even though it was, again, not a major political city, but many of the kings who ruled over areas of Mesopotamia, right? So more than one city. Some call them empires, although my dissertation director doesn't believe that we should use that term before the Neo-Assyrian Empire, but again, another question. Many of them would go to Nippur to be crowned. This was the home of Enlil, and yes, the structure on the top was built in the early 1900s by the Penn excavations at Nippur. So definitely not something we would do today, but this is where they lived. So back in the old days, they didn't get to stay at the the Ritz Jerusalem like we did, Dr. Graves, and they had to rough it camping out in the wild. And this structure literally looks like a fortress because it was to protect them from bandits at Nippur when they excavated.
Yeah. I see here in my slide, I have Nippur, Egypt. It's not Egypt. That's a
Not
typo
Egypt.
there.
Yeah, not Egypt.
No.
Can I ask why is the soil so kind of orangish?
Well, this I think is lighting. It's actually a grayish sort of soil, and it's mostly like essentially it's
Yeah.
clay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this would have been the denudation of the mud bricks, is what you're seeing. You can kind
Yeah.
of make out something of the bricks there and a little bit of it, but this is mud brick built up, and it's been rained on and wind blown for thousands of years at this point.
Yeah. There's a lot of iron oxide in the soil in Jordan where we work, in the Jordan Valley, and so the photographs that we take are generally this kind of orange. But when you get right down and you look at the dirt, as you say, it's a lot of it's very gray and it's decomposed mud brick.
Yeah.
You're looking at. So
one interesting point, just while it's on the screen here, you see these two these holes that run through the middle. Yeah, right there. So I actually have a photograph from my time there. You can see straight through the structure with that. So those would have been perhaps wooden beams that would have lent support to the structure. So the interesting way about how these are built is every so many courses, say 10 courses of mud brick, you would have reed matting, which gave it flexibility, right? It's a big building, and just like we kind of try to earthquake-proof buildings today to where they'll sway and bend but not break, they also did the same thing with reed matting. And in fact, at Dur Galzer, you can still see the reeds poking out of their reed mats every I think it's every 14 courses of mud brick. And they would also have beams often that would run through the middle of the ziggurat, and it's an empty hole now because the wood has been it's deteriorated and it's been eaten up by moisture and such over the last 1,000 years, and now they've left these holes that you can actually see straight through.
Oh, interesting fact. Great, didn't know that. Here's another photo of Eridu.
Yes, and here you can see that black stuff on top. That is pitch. So that is what they use to stick all those bricks together. And yeah, if this is Eridu, those bricks are squares. So in Egypt, you probably know better than I do. I think that they're rectangular bricks. Most of the ziggurat bricks are actually perfect squares.
Yeah, yeah. In Jericho, they're rectangular, the mud brick that we have there from the time of the conquest. When I was there, I've got a photo of me holding one of them, but interesting. Yeah, they're here. You can see, I guess, one up here. They're more square.
Yeah. And many of them are stamped. So that's how we can date them. Is whoever king built did the original construction, or they of course had to be renovated very often. The bricks would be stamped with your name on them in cuneiform.
Yes.
I have a couple pictures of those too.
Yeah, I have some. I didn't put them in, but one with Nebuchadnezzar on it, and I mean that's how we know a lot of them. So, well, that's the end of my photographs. Just a bit of a tour. Appreciate your input.
Yeah, no, very well done.
That's great. Just give everybody a bit of an idea of what they look like and a bit of a tour around. I wish I was able to have seen them, but that's the one place I never did get to explore in the ancient Near East. Been to almost every other place.
Not an easy trip in any way to take. It was
no.
a lot of bureaucratic wrangling to get there, a lot of discomfort, and very scary highways and Iraqi drivers while you were there too.
Yeah, I went to we flew into Ankara in Turkey, and then we drove to Mount Ararat, so I can relate to the crazy driving.
Yeah,
and I got actually arrested and detained, and when I was there at Mount Ararat, so I have some experience with it not being the safest place to go.
I had no idea that you had a criminal record in Turkey. It's good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, we were detained. Apparently, the military officer that gave us permission to climb on the Armenian side of Mount Ararat was not the right official. The right guy was out getting groceries for his wife.
Yeah.
So, but fortunately, what got us out of hot water was that our guide, he had gone to military school with the commander that had arrested us, and so he was able to get us out of the situation. We lost some of our photographs, but we did get our cameras back, and we got a pizza out of it, and we did get on our merry way.
It's always something like that over there. I tell you, all of these sites we went to, they're tourist spots. The people who work there know that tourists want to come there. We had a member of the Iraqi, whatever Ministry of Tourism was there on our bus with us.
Yeah.
And every single place we pulled up to, it was always shouting in Arabic and probably the exchange of some dinars, and then we would get to go. But you always had to show up at the gate and have the argument, and then you got to go in. So
we did this when we went to the Delta region, Egypt, and we had a four-wheel drive in front of us with armed guards all in it. And every time we come to a U-turn, because you have to do these U-turns, they would toot the horn. It's like, let's announce the Americans are here.
Yeah. They did that in I can't remember where we were, but it was in one of the Shiite holy cities. We got to our hotel at 10:30 at night local time, and it was like we were leading a parade, and it was like, man, this doesn't seem like a very good OPSEC here. we probably could have done this a little bit better, but flashing lights and guys with AK-47s and yeah.
So it's always an adventure when you go over to the Middle East. So
it's always an adventure there.
Yeah, but I really enjoyed it, and some fond memories
for sure.
And I must say, in all the 15 years I worked at Tel El Hammam in Jordan, I felt very safe, and of course we were protected by the Adwan family, and nobody messes with the Adwan family, even the government. So it was helpful that he owned the property of Saddam, basically.
Yeah. It's a little different in Iraq. I have to say, I felt safer there than I thought I would. And even when I met people, I was upfront and honest. I said they would ask me where I'm from, and they're you see me. There's not really any denying it. I'm an American. I would just say United States of America. And 99% of everyone, they were very gracious. They're very welcoming. Of course, we were in the South, and they had their issues with Saddam, and we had deposed him. So perhaps that was why.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, at night you'd hear grenades or car bombs, and you'd hear automatic weapons fire almost every night. And there was one instance. In fact, we were at Durkura Galzu, where we were kind of getting to the point where it was time to wrap up and get on the bus, and we heard very distinctive crackling AK-47 fire in the distance, and the tour guide said, "Everybody back on the bus, time to go."
Yeah, we'd have helicopters flying over our site pretty much on a weekly basis, checking us out and seeing what we were doing. And but we would always have about 3 members of the Department of Antiquities working with us on site. And we had our licenses, of course, from so we were officially there, but they were still patrolling because we're in the Jordan Valley, the border between. But it was always peaceful, and sometimes you'd hear a few shots and a bit of gunfire going off. There'd be some locals doing something in a farmyard somewhere, and it felt pretty safe and some good memories. Any plans to go back, Matt, at all?
Well, it'll probably be a while. Military duties have kept me pretty busy when I'm not teaching. So that sort of eats up most summers now when I can. And also there are issues with permissions and clearances now and things like that. So I really do hope to go back, and I do follow the Shiloh dig in particular when
Yeah,
they update their social media, and I'm get a little sad that I'm not there.
yeah,
So someday,
likewise.
yeah.
You know, this year they're going to be building an addition. I was talking to Stephen Rudd. Going to be doing
Excuse me.
going to be doing an addition to the wet sifting station. He's going to be putting in one for bones. So they're going to be doing some sifting of the bones that they have found at Shiloh
Yeah,
with Dr. Green Green Greenwald. He's University of Manitoba anyway. He's a bone specialist,
okay,
and so they're doing a lot of work with the bones they've discovered at Shiloh, being significant, of course, being from the sacrificial system where the Ark of the Covenant was. So Stephen Rudd's going to produce his new elaborate. He's got all the parts. He's going to ship them over there, and
yeah, he's the guy. If you got need something built on the dig, he's the guy. He's the genius at that.
yeah. So I was talking to Stephen the other day, and he's got that all ready to go. So some new technology on the site, and we continue to use new methods all the time in our archaeology. So
Yeah,
for your viewers to know, it's a
someday,
scientific excavation.
someday I'll be back. Yeah, someday,
Yeah,
definitely plans to. No, nothing specific yet, but definitely someday want to get back.
good.
Dr. Glassman,
Yep.
I have maybe 10 questions from your thesis that you can take as short or long
Yeah,
time as you
fire away.
please. Dr. Graves, I don't know how busy you are or tired. You're welcome to stay with us as much as you can. I would like if Dr. Glassman can answer some questions that
fire
I
away.
may desire.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll
thank you.
hang in there.
Okay, the first one comes from your subchapter called "The Origins and Previous Scholarship," and I'm especially interested when you mentioned this doctor with French last name Perot or Perot,
Yeah,
something like that, who has speculated the outline of a general process whereby humans built increasingly taller structures
yes,
beginning in the third millennium BC, and then he came up with this thesis, well, not thesis, hypothesis or theory, where there could be two shrines, uh, uh, on the top of the ziggurat. Well, one on the top, one at the lower level, and
Yep.
then he says the higher shrine was a threshold for the goddess he or she would enter the earthly realm, and the lower one was a larger, more comfortable abode. And honestly, until I read this in your thesis, I did not know this. I thought it would be always one sanctuary or one shrine. So I thought maybe if you can give some comment on that, please.
Yeah. So again, the much of this is very speculative. So Perot is an older Assyriologist. The technical, archaeology is actually, now that we mention it, relatively new science. So we only started digging these things up back in the basically mid 19th century because the British had access to Iraq and places like that. So Assyriology was really spawned from some of these early efforts. And I think, I want to be kind here, I think much of this was with the best intentions, perhaps a bit ambitious in terms of its speculation. So the two shrine theory was not really something I spent a ton of time looking into. There is, in fact, this has been revived a little bit. I believe he wrote in the 90s and early 2000s a scholar named Alinga Kosolich, who's an Austrian, if I'm not mistaken, who wrote a very elegant theory that's somewhat similar to if my memory is correct, what Perot said. Unfortunately, it's all in German, so it's not really accessible to. And I was not I knew enough German to kind of muddle through it, but basically that there's some correspondence between the primary sanctuary, which is on the ground, right? So if we look at for instance, at the city of Babylon, the major enormous temple that would have been the main temple of Babylon is something called the Esangil temple. And then a Temenanki was the ziggurat with the Gugunum or the temple at the top. And what archaeologists says is that the ziggurat is essentially the ground temple, the main ground temple, kind of extended, basically. Now, there's a lot in what he said that I liked, mainly that there is an intentionality to the ziggurat, which I certainly believe. This is why I say that structures pre-existing Ornamu, I don't think I would not call them ziggurats, because I think that this is something that is an intentional architectural form. And yet, part of me, the basic question I had was, okay, well, if you have a ground temple, then why do you need the ziggurat? And if you have the ziggurat, then why do you need the ground temple? Why both? Why does that make sense? Because this is an enormous amount of time and manpower and expense, right? Even just to make the bricks. I think that the excavator at Babylon, his name was Schmid, estimated something like 30 million bricks made.
Yeah, that's what I read in your thesis.
That
And
is-
it says another one says it took up to 3 years to be built with 140
Yes.
something workers. So that was like
Yeah.
a lot of work. I don't think it was just for a monument of beauty or might. It had some
It had to have
more meaning to the ancients.
some practical and intentional considerations. I agree. So I don't know. I'd have to go back and reread Perot on this, to be quite honest. I'm not sure why he thought that, but there are others who seem to be convinced of this. I don't think that that's the case myself, but I don't have a terribly strong opinion on it, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, but what is more interesting to me about what you asked is this sort of evolutionary process by which we ended up at the ziggurat, and that I do have to say I do not think is the case. Do we have structures that are on top of different structures and had accumulated height? Yeah, if you look at Eridu, if you go to the temple, the main temple at Eridu, and you dig down all the way to temple number 1, the very first one, the oldest one, you'll have to dig through 17 levels and 17 different temples, right? Because you'd have a temple, and then it would either wear away and you'd have to be renovated, or they wanted to build a bigger one, and so they would knock it down, fill in the foundations, and build another one, right? So essentially what you're talking about is filling in old foundations or ruins to make a new platform for the next bigger one, right? So case in point, Herod's reconstruction of the Temple Mount, right? That's essentially what happened. And so many of these scholars believe that, well, over time, we just kind of arrived at the ziggurat out of a process of microevolution, essentially. I do not think that is what happened. I think what you have here is something, and again, just think of the sheer amount of time and cost and manpower, the amount of resources that a society that's compared to ours is pretty resource bereft devoted to this. This is a major undertaking. It's not just something that happened. I think that this is an intentional thing, and that it was the brainchild of at least one man. And as far as I can tell, it's Ornamu, because that's when we first see them. So the sort of proof text that everyone offers is this thing called the Anu Ziggurat, which is in the city of Uruk. And I went there. I went to Uruk, and there are kind of two mounds, two major parts of the city there. One is a definitive ziggurat, the ziggurat dedicated to a goddess Inanna in the Ur-3 style. And then you walk across the city, which for an ancient city would have been an enormous metropolis. It was a 10 or 15 minute walk away. And you get to this place called the Anu Ziggurat. And it's called ziggurat. And in my dissertation, if you noticed, I put it in quotes because I don't actually think it's a ziggurat. Was it a temple on top of a terrace? Well, yes, it was. Didn't have the 3 staircases. Didn't have the same particular form as, at least in the reconstructions, as the ziggurats that were in other places, including at Uruk. And so I don't think technically that is a ziggurat. It also had there was about 1,000-year gulf between when the Anu Ziggurat had its foundations and construction to when we get to the Earth-3 period. So there's actually a long distance in time there as well that I think people overlook. But I don't think this is just a kind of process of evolution, and then boom, all of a sudden we get to 3 stages, triple staircase, temple at the top. I don't think that's the case. I think that had to be intentional, conceptual, and that's just a philosophically different thing. That this thing that we call ziggurat today, and which is specifically referred to by the Akkadian term Zigguratu. I think that's different than temples on terraces.
Thank you. My next question is a very short one. You mentioned that in a couple of ziggurats, I think it was Babylon and Susa, you mentioned that there were like horns on top of the ziggurat. So I was just curious, what do these horns represent?
Yeah, this is we don't really know. We do have we have horns on other buildings too, so other sacred buildings, and we do have I can't remember which is which, but I think we have iconography of the Susa ziggurat, if I'm not mistaken, with horns on it. And then we also have this word in Akkadian, Karnu. So for Dr. Graves in Hebrew, this is Karen, this would be a cognate. So Karnu in Akkadian. On mounted atop the, what I suppose mounted on top of the temple, atop the ziggurat. And the simple answer is nobody really knows. Why did it have horns? I don't know. Did it look nice? Well, maybe that's possible. Horns also seem to represent power in ancient cultures. That was sort of my best guess at it. But we do have some of this ornamentation that is attested both in iconography and in text. Yeah, that's true.
And we find the horns coming up, of course, in the altars.
Yes.
In Israel, and we found actually a motif on a piece of pottery with a bull with down-turned horns, like we'd have in the Minoan culture. So very prevalent in the ancient Near East.
Yeah,
the idea of horn and strength. So it may have just been aesthetics, but
yeah, it could be.
Okay, thank you for that. When it comes to etymology, I know that you already gave a couple of explanations, Dr. Glassman, but I was reading like in old Akkadian, Zigguratu could be interpreted as a protrusion from the earth. Then in Babylonian Aramaic, it means to rejoice or to stand up straight, or to plow handle in Arabic. Then the root word occurs at the west as well, which would mean to weave in Aramaic or to throw in Canaanite. Then there's so many other explanations. So is there any unifying or mutual meaning that we can just come up with sort of a, imperfect kind of definition? What would ziggurat mean to all of these, ancient Near East nations?
Yeah, I think what's happening here, unfortunately, the simple answer is no. And I think what you're seeing is a couple things. So number one, my suspicion, which came out, I'm sure, in what you read, is that this is probably has some influence from Sumerian. It's probably something of a loan. Loan words often come into Akkadian from Sumerian and act very weird. And I didn't really delve into this in the dissertation because this is kind of what I thought about after I had written it and turned it in, is perhaps what you have is something that goes from Akkadian to Sumerian back to Akkadian, or Sumerian to Akkadian back to Sumerian, something like that. So we're washing it through these two different languages, and that's why the term comes out funny. It doesn't act like a normal Semitic word, so I think that it's a combination of both the Semitic root mixed with Sumerian influence is basically what we have. Now, in terms of what you see in the West, what you're seeing here very likely is different roots that have essentially fallen together as they come down from Proto-Semitic, right? So we have this theoretical language that is totally unattested in the ancient Near East called Proto-Semitic. And we know that something like it must have existed because we have Arabic, we have Aramaic, we have Hebrew, we have Canaanite, we have Phoenician, we have Akkadian, and all these languages share affinities. But whatever that tree, we can't. We have the branches, but not the trunk. Essentially, is what we have. Okay. Now, in Semitic languages especially, sibilants, that is S sounds, Z sounds, SH sounds, and the hard like tsade sounds, they all act very funny. And TH as well. All those things, they actualize differently in different languages. So in one language, for instance, you could have a Z, and in the other language you could have the exact same root and have an S, right? And in that, in fact, even happened in Mesopotamia, where in the south you would have the Z sign, Ziggurats, and then later on in Assyrian in the north you would have the simple sibilant, the S, Ziggurats. So my guess is what happens is we have the mixing of some sibilants in the west, and also the mixing of some different roots, right? Because some of those roots don't have anything to do with one another. Many of them, like you could maybe argue that to stand up or stand tall is similar to Zakaru, which is to be big or tall in the east. So that might be a cognate, but there are some of them that are just they're so semantically different than that concept that they must have been a different root, and their sibilants just actualized differently in those West Semitic languages as it came down over time through Proto-Semitic. Yeah.
But we find the same thing, do we not, Matt, with modern languages? So, for example, Russian in Moscow is certainly different from the Russian they speak in St. Petersburg.
Yes.
Or you have the same thing with Portuguese. The way they speak Portuguese in mainland Portugal, my wife speaks Portuguese, and Brazilian Portuguese.
Yes.
So, or even the accent. We live on a little island in the middle of the Atlantic on Madeira, which is Portugal, but with a lot of the words that they speak and use on the island are older, and they're different from the mainland. So we find the same thing here, even with English, whether you're Newfoundland or mainland Canada. So we find the same phenomena, I think, in modern languages. And to use the parallel back in those times, there are different variations of the use of the words, whether you're from the east or the west or north or the south.
Yeah, time and distance will differentiate and isolate different sounds and different words.
Yeah,
even within the same family even within the same language or family of languages.
And the other thing that one of my theories, of course, is that, well, it's not even a theory. I mean, it's a known fact that it's an oral language, and so the scribes are writing down what they hear, and so depending on the accent that somebody uses, they may spell it differently even.
Yes, I say this to my so every other year I teach Greek and Hebrew, and just got done teaching Hebrew this year, and I tell my students all the time, because they get frustrated because they want uniformity and with the rules, right? And you don't always get that, right? We first study language in the ideal, and then we get into reading text, and sometimes those are two different things. So I say, look, in ancient cultures, producing text is much more difficult than it is today, right? We have cell phones, we can text easily today. That it's easy to create text. In ancient times, right, you have papyrus, or you have clay, or you have animal skin. It's very difficult, and you have to create the ink, and it's very difficult to create text. Most people weren't doing it, and so these languages are primarily oral first, and then scribes are committing that language, which is oral, to a fixed form, which is writing, but they're hearing it, right? And so, depending on your scribe, you may not hear the same thing,
or the accent of the speaker.
Exactly. Yeah. So regional differences. Think about going to the southern United States versus you speaking the same English in New York City.
Yep.
You very, very well hear the if you're only hearing it and someone tells you, "Hey, write down a note, write this down," you could end up with two very different notes in New York City versus somewhere in the deep south.
Tomato.
Tomato. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So, and the other thing is that they're not. There's no standardization of words. So a lot of these, tablets that we're finding, in Israel, Um, everybody thinks it's a standard spelling of a word. They're actually writing it down as a scribe on the basis of what they're hearing.
Yes.
So depending on what they're saying, the accent they have, you may have an aleph, or you might have an ayin or something on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Glassman, I just want to read a few short sentences by Herodotus, who was like a Greek historian and author. It's very interesting. Well, at least I find it very interesting how he was writing about this Babylonian sexual rite. So he says, in the midmost of one division of the city stands the royal palace, surrounded by a high and strong wall. And in the midmost of the other is still to this day the sacred enclosure of Zeus Belus, which is very interesting to me because first Zeus was not a deity in Mesopotamia, yet is used. And I don't know if Belus comes from Baal as Lord, if this is like a just linguistic difference. So this is very interesting how Zeus is used as the Lord or the master, and then he continues saying, a square of the 2 furlongs each way with gates of bronze. In the center of this enclosure is a solid tower that has been built, but in the last tower there's a great shrine, and in it is a great and well-covered couch which is laid, and a golden table set hard by. But no image has been set in the shrine, nor does any human creature lie therein for the night, except one native woman, chosen from all women by the god, as the Chaldeans say, who are priests of this god. These same Chaldeans say, but I do not believe them. So he's just being honest here, that the god himself wants to visit the shrine and rest upon the couch, even in the Thebes of Egypt, as the Egyptians say, for there too also a woman sleeps in the temple of Zeus, and neither the Egyptian nor the Babylonian woman, it is says, has intercourse with men. So I would assume it means, well, it has intercourse with this god. And I know you said earlier it's controversial. We also talked about this topic. I just wanted to read, when it comes to some other source that is not necessarily coming from ancient Near East, but also Greek. I thought that this is interesting, that someone who is outside from this area would introduce in their writings. I don't know if you necessarily have a comment on this, but I thought it's fun to read.
Yeah. So first of all, Herodotus kind of comes into and goes out of fashion. He's sort of like a he's sort of like a denim jacket, right? I had one in grade school back in the mid '80s, and then we all laughed at those pictures in the '90s and the 2000s. And then, what do you know? A couple years ago, my preteen daughter had my wife buy her one, so it's back now. Herodotus, we all believed him back when people were thinking about and theorizing about the sacred marriage rite. Then he fell out of fashion for a long time. When I was in graduate school, we didn't believe him, and we even perhaps thought that he'd never even visited Babylon and just made all this up. I think now we are turning around, and he's coming back into, so he may come back into fashion again. So there is that. There is question about whether or not we trust Herodotus as a source. I would say, though, that this is the basis for speculation about the sacred marriage rite. So it seems as though Herodotus has heard this from, and Chaldeans here are Babylonians, right? That's by that point the Chaldeans are Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar is a Chaldean, for instance. The Zeus Belus thing is interesting. I would read that as, and of course willing to be corrected here, I would simply read that as the most high god, right? So he uses Zeus as a sort of terminology to express this is the head of their pantheon. And certainly at that point in history, Baal, or Baal, as they would have called him in Mesopotamia, that's Marduk. Marduk would have been the head of the pantheon there, as Zeus would have been anomalous in Greece.
Can we compare this with, I just thought about this, I didn't plan mentioning, can we compare this with El Elyon, mentioned in the Old Testament as the Most High God? Can it be, when it comes to titles, something like that?
Yeah, those are always very tricky. I'm not sure. Dr. Graves may have a comment on this, but I suppose it's possible that, and again, this is another sticky question as to when precisely we have, strictly speaking, monotheism even in the Old Testament, as opposed to something like henotheism. But yeah, there's a sense that perhaps this is an idea that now, whatever pantheon we're talking about, El Elyon, or El Shaddai, Yahweh is the Most High God. Yeah, that's possible, I suppose.
I would understand them as different characteristics of the main God. He's described in terms of his attributes, Elyon and El Shaddai, and so on. I have a section in my book. I publish all the different names, but they all seem to portray a particular attribute of God, rather than a different, independent, God.
Right. Yeah, and I think for Herodotus, this is just him saying Baelus is their Zeus, right? So because he presumably he's writing to people who are his fellow countrymen about his experiences in the East, and that's what I take it to mean, that this is what they call Zeus there, or this is their Zeus, one of those two.
Yeah, their Zeus is what I would say it. Yeah.
Dr. Glassman, can you please explain briefly what is the difference between southern and northern ziggurats? I found the explanations very interesting because they differ.
Yeah, so the southern types would be more of the classical form. So what we talked about, triple staircase, 3 stages typically, although Babylon is an exception, because Babylon was kind of its own special place and special city. Northern types are different. There seems to be a bit more creativity. Now, so one of them was, they had different numbers of stages. At Dur Sharkin, I think we have different. We had a lot of we had even maybe the bottom part of the 4th stage still remaining there. Very sadly, many of these were destroyed by ISIS in the very recent past. They bulldozed them, in fact. So they're not accessible anymore. But we did have them. We also have different accesses to the top. So one of them does seem to be a kind of winding ramp, maybe similar to the medieval painting that Dr. Graves showed us of the Tower of Babel. So there seems to be a bit of architectural creativity in the north, where there's not necessarily a standard form. I would, however, conceptualize these as derivative, and the reason why is because of the wider context of Assyria. While it was for many years the dominant power in the ancient Near East and dominated Babylon to its south, they got their culture from the Babylonians. So the nearest analogy I can think of would be Rome and Greece during the kind of late Roman Republic, early Empire period, where Rome is dominating the Mediterranean basin and it's dominating the Greek East and the old Hellenistic states. And yet, how many Roman philosophers can you rattle off? Maybe Seneca. But if I asked you about Greek philosophers and Greek culture, you tell me a bunch, right? We've got Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. That's because the Romans, by and large, they were very good at military and administration and law, but they got their culture from the Greeks, right? They even as they dominated them politically, they revered Greek culture, and many Romans even took to learning Greek. In the same way, the Assyrians, even while they are politically dominating their Babylonian neighbors to the south, always a kind of thorn in their side, they did receive their culture by and large from the Babylonian south. Babylon really was the Rome of the ancient world before it was Rome. It was everything. Many people had moved into Babylon from other places, like Eridu, for instance. There was an Eridu town, if you will, in Babylon, and many other cultures had moved in there to make it a very cosmopolitan place. It really was the jewel of the ancient world, up through really through the 6th and 5th millennium into the Persian period. And it was that for many, many years, about a millennium. It was the major cultural cosmopolitan center of the world. And so we see, what do we see in Assyria in the north, even as they're subjugating the Babylonians, we see them imitating their culture.
Thank you. The last question, first I would like to read, you mentioned a couple of functions that Ziggurats served. I'll just mention them again. One of them was mentioned by the scholars to serve as an artificial mountain. Another one said that the ziggurat was an elevated building to protect from flood. The third one says that it was used as an observatory or simply a respite from the heat and mosquitoes. Another one said that it had a sacred function by arguing that an association with antecedent temple terraces. Another scholar said that it was symbolic, figuring that the stage tower was a representation of the universe. I found that very interesting. Then the next one said that the ziggurat was maybe a divine throne or altar. Another one added to this and said that it was an earthly residence for the god to whom it was dedicated. Then again, the next one said that the ziggurat was a staircase that would assist the deity to descend from the heavens and take up residence in his or her ground temple. And then as two subchapters, you mentioned cultic aspects, where I also found this so interesting, especially when we compare this to the Bible. It says the ziggurat was also associated with a divine communal meal. And texts as early as the Sumerian temple hymns refer to the ziggurat unir as the great dining hall of Eridu. And this is also connected with the Hellenistic period, where it says, to as many gods as are sitting in the courtyard, he brings the meal in the night watch to the roof, to Barama, the ziggurat of the Resh, and some other things like, people would bring sacrifices. And that reminds me of the Bible, how, but only partially, because in the Bible, God wants to commune with us, and we don't bring anything to sacrifice to God when it comes to this as if God has any need to eat. Rather, he brings food to us. He brought manna in the desert. Jesus, after the resurrection, he cooks fish for his disciples. I see this similarity, but also the opposites. How Yahweh does not need anything from us. Opposite, from some ancient Near East mythologies, where people were supposedly created by deities because deities needed someone to serve them. We see Yahweh as very different, and this divine communion, even though it reminds me of the Bible, is actually the opposite side of how the divinities in the ancient Near East represented this divine communal meal versus Yahweh and people. And the last one, which you explained or mentioned as the cosmic function, was the ziggurat as universal nexus. And you again mentioned some scholars like human society was actually a replica on earth of the divine society in the heavens. And the ziggurat was the physical link between the two realms. And you mentioned Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade, who identified the ziggurat as a cosmic mountain. We hear this from Walton, from Heiser and other people. I just want to say that also in this one with the universal nexus, I see some parallels with the Bible. How us and maybe the sacred ground we built for our God represents the divine family. And I mean, it is true. Besides the divine family, God always wanted to have a human family, not because he needed us, but because he loved us, and out of that love, he created us. So take as much as you want to for this question. I have no more questions. How the ziggurat serves all these different functions, and how it can be paralleled in some instances with the Bible.
Yeah, well, so first of all, not all the things that you mentioned there are my ideas. My kind of primary function identification was as a communication function, and yes, to actually link all the realms of the Babylonian universe together, the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. And we do get specific language about those in some of the especially the building dedications. To zoom out just for a second, yeah, we have very different anthropologies in the Bible versus Mesopotamia, and in the latter, it's actually quite dour and fairly depressing, right? In the Bible, God, regardless of who you are, you read Genesis, and it's clear that God makes the human beings for their own sake, right? He doesn't really have a use for them. He doesn't necessarily need them. Whereas in Mesopotamia, it's a much more it's a much lower and much more pessimistic anthropology. They believe that the gods had made them to basically do physical work and physical labor that the gods did not want to do, and that doesn't lead to a very uplifting outlook or worldview, and certainly they didn't have one. That there is a sort of strain of pessimism that runs through all Babylonian literature, from the flood literature all the way down to some of the late Babylonian stuff, right up against the Hellenistic period. Right. So if we look at something like Atrahasis, the Babylonian flood narrative, right? Human beings are created and to do work, and then why the flood? Well, in Genesis 6, we learn that the flood comes because of human moral failure, right? There's a specific reason why the flood in the Bible. What's the reason for the flood in Mesopotamia?
They're too loud, right?
They're too loud. Literally, we're making too much
I
noise.
read it a while ago. That was hilarious.
Therefore, on a whim, Enlil can just say, wipe them out. Who cares? We made them as slaves. Get rid of them, right? Whereas in Genesis 6, as terrible as the flood must have been, the idea, right, the narrative communicates regeneration, right? That is the point of Genesis 6-9 is rebirth, remaking something. Whereas in yeah.
And when I'm teaching, I use a simple analogy, and what we find in Scripture is that God made man in His image. In the ancient Near Eastern idea, man makes God in His image.
Yes, exactly right, and the same is true of Greece and Rome in the classical world as well.
Exactly.
Those gods are they're jealous, they're capricious, they're just as awful as we are. They're basically superhumans that have all the problems that we do.
Yeah, and they just reverse it.
Yeah, they just reverse it. So that's the kind of general context here. But still, they are gods, and so they need to be served. If we're Mesopotamians, and we, and kind of expressing what I believe to be something that is an anthropological longing, is the desire for human beings to be nearer to divinity. Right? We can say that specifically in Christianity, that we are made to desire God, and that's the only thing that's ever going to fulfill us. Right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee. Well, that's garbled in Mesopotamia, but they still want to be close to divinity, right? They still want to access the divine things. How do you do that? Well, you build something to get to them. Some of the things you mentioned they're actually rabbinical interpretations of the Tower of Babel story. Avoidance of the flood, right? So Nimrod once builds this to avoid the flood, just in case God changes his mind. It does send another one. There are also suggestions that Nimrod is actually building this as a kind of stairway to heaven, to wage war on God as a sort of war of revenge for his ancestors. All those things are rabbinical interpretations of the tower story, and they've also then of course been cast onto the ziggurat if those two things are identified. But why the ziggurat, right? What's the meaning of this thing? I think number one, this is an outgrowth of an anthropological longing for humankind to access the things of the divine, right? And this crosscuts many different cultures. We find right, where do the pagan peoples in Canaan worship? They worship on the Bahamot, the high places, right? They worship on the high. They go to the high places. We've always conceived of this as human beings as God is above us, right? Or the gods they're up there somewhere, right? Or Mount Olympus. They're up there somewhere, partially inaccessible. But if we want to get as close as we can, we go to the highest places we can. We go up to the mountain. We go up to the high place, the hills. And in so far as the ziggurat is that, it imitates at least the holy mountain. Now,
the temple.
Yeah, right. Even the temple. And what also does it do? And I think I labeled this the cosmological function in my own dissertation, was that this is a way to link all the realms of the universe together. So in some of the inscriptions, we learn that the the ziggurat is moored in the underworld. Okay? It's in Sumerian indicating its foundations are beneath the earth. Right? It's built first in the underworld, and then it's built up through the earth, and then it's what we mentioned this before. Where is its top? Its top is like the heavens or in the heavens. So it links all of those areas together. Of course, one interesting thing about Mesopotamians, which is a little different than the Bible, they have gods of the underworld as well. So, and those gods are they're even meaner and like you even less than the gods that live in the heavens. But the ziggurat is the way then to link all of these realms together, right? It serves an integrative function where the heavens are linked with the underworld. So I think those are the two primary functions. And of course, there's been a lot of speculation about what else this might mean, but a lot of that comes from later biblical interpretation of the Genesis 11 story. So that's at least my best guess as to what the ziggurat is doing. I would say that what is very clear, whether I'm right or not, is this is definitely something intentional. So you don't spend 3 years and millions of bricks, right? Think about all the people just making the bricks, right? And then all the people who are hauling the bricks, and then people who are putting the bricks in place, the people who are processing the bitumen, the people who are processing the reed mats. Doing all this is not done just so, right? It's not done just because. There must be a specific function for this, and it must have been highly important for them to devote all this time and manpower and resources to doing this.
Yeah, as I read by the end of your thesis, it said that the purpose of ziggurat was built not just for gods, but also for humans. Yeah. Gentlemen, it's been such an honor. It's been such a pleasure. Dr. Glassman, thank you so much for accepting to come on the podcast by the Dr. Graves' invitation. Thank you for sharing your thesis and material with me. Dr. Graves, thank you for sharing those wonderful, beautiful slides with us and for contributing to the topic. I just want to, thank you both in the name of the audience and myself. I just want to say, happy Mother's Day to all the mothers watching this either today or in the coming days. And I would just invite everyone to, keep liking and sharing the material so we can promote the podcast. If you find this information useful, please leave a comment, say how it has impacted your life. I believe all of us will be pleased to know that, and keep sharing it on social media. And that being said, we shall see you next Sunday. And I have another surprising guest for you guys. God bless and take care. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Graves. Thank you, Nicola. Have a great time. And have a good night.
Thank you. Good to connect with you again, Matt. Thanks. Good, Nicola. Thanks.